Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Will Stiles. I'm from the Knowledge Exchange Hub for Farming Connect, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about controlled environment agriculture and some of the benefits we might derive from this new technology in terms of food production, particularly from the horticultural sector. I'll start by talking a little bit about some of the issues we have currently in food production and the reason why this technology has come about, and some of the I suppose the reasons why we think it is going to be such a big thing in the future because of some of the benefits that we can possibly derive. Before we then move on and have a little look at some of the existing systems, some of the technologies and how they bolt together, and some of the potential things that some of the potential future benefits that we might derive once this technology moves past its initial infancy and becomes a bit more mainstream. So starting from the very beginning then, in that case, what is controlled environment agriculture? Well, as the name suggests, it is literally in food production in an environment where you control all of the environmental parameters. This has come typically to mean food production in indoors, non-natural light environments. That's not necessarily entirely fair, because I would argue that a controlled environment is anything where you are manipulating the environment slightly. So a polytunnel, under that definition, is or has some environmental control. You are taking away certain environmental variables, frost for instance, which would impact on the potential for food production. But really, when we start talking about CEA as a technology, we are talking about factory style scenarios where we control all of the environmental parameters. And the interesting thing about that is, once we do start to control all of the environment, it offers certain opportunities to manipulate the plants, to manipulate the environment itself, which might give us favourable production advantages. And I'll cycle back to that thought a little bit later on in the talk. But to begin with, this is how we should imagine it. We sometimes call it vertical farming because often you would stack crops in these systems, because obviously if you're not using natural light, if you're using LEDs, then you can maximize your space this way. But that is by no means a typical or an absolute scenario. You can have taller plants, tomatoes are a great example for instance, which are floor standing, so you've only got one level. It is very much about the environment itself. And I think that's highlighted quite neatly here. If we look at the image in the top right-hand corner, I think is Thanet Earth, which is a major greenhouse producer. And obviously, as you can see there, it's glass, so it does have natural light. It's obviously a greenhouse environment, but it has supplementary light. It's going to have some of the environmental elements altered slightly, i.e. they pump CO2 in to prime the plants. The warmth, the temperature on the inside will be regulated, the amount of airflow will be regulated, and obviously they will be regulating the nutrients or the nutrient solution which was introduced to the plant. So a lot of the environmental elements are manipulated within such an environment. So I guess that's the better way to think of it in those regards. So why has the technology for controlled environmental agriculture become a thing in recent years? And it is, only relatively in recent times. We've obviously had polytunnels a lot longer, but the concept of plants in factory style production systems is a relatively new thing. The last decade or so, I would argue, is where it's really come to the fore. The simple reason for this is we have some major challenges in the future in existing agricultural practice. We will both suffer from and contribute to climate change. And if you take away the environmental impact for a second, if we just consider food production in its purest sense, food production is going to become slightly more challenging, particularly of really soft, vulnerable goods like lettuces, etc. in a field system, because we can no longer predict the climate in exactly the same way. We're getting a lot more freak weather events, factors which can destroy an entire crop. So if you are a producer, if you're a major horticultural production outfit, then obviously not being able to predict the effects on your crop breeds a certain uncertainty into your business model. If you could take away that uncertainty, it's obviously quite a tantalising prospect. Simultaneously, we do obviously have to manage the actual effect we have on the environment too. And soil degradation, nutrient pollution, all of these things as a consequence of agriculture are problematic. And it is just possible that by virtue of control in a controlled environment, we may take away some of those negative effects, or at least we can reduce them. There is an argument we could take away production and put it into controlled systems and then turn the lands that we're not using back over for nature, for carbon storage, or for any other of the public goods or natural capital asset goals that we might benefit from in the future. There's a few ways you could look at it in that regard. I think personally, it's better just to think of the challenges in agriculture. And let's face it, we have plenty just in the agricultural sector. If we're talking about food waste, if we're talking about aging farmers, excessive water usage, food miles, the list goes on, then this could be a potential solution for all of these things. We could build controlled farms next to distribution hubs for people like Tesco and reduce food miles. We are introducing technology into the sector and thus creating potentially high technology jobs or technological jobs which are likely to appeal to the younger generation, and they're likely to be better paid, for instance, than perhaps land management is currently. So there are a range of scenarios, a range of opportunities which this could potentially offer us that we may well derive benefit from. So this slide is literally just meant to highlight the point I'm making before. We are already seeing some of the mass effects of more unpredictable weather extremes in the UK alone, and that is leading to food shortages. And that has an effect on food security, on our food production systems, everything in the UK. There is a challenge there. And the minute we start having shelves which are bare of lettuce, then there is an issue. There is I would suggest furthermore as well, we get a lot of our produce, particularly our leafy green, our sort of soft salads, etc., from abroad, which is much larger food miles, but also decreased food security, particularly when we're buying them in a world post-Brexit or a world which is slightly more unpredictable, and from regions which are going to suffer climate change even more readily than we are here in the UK. So we need to have systems in place where we can manage some of this future impact on our food supply chains and our food security, and arguably taking control over the environment, creating produce from a scenario where we have absolute control is the best way we can come up with to do so. So the question then becomes quite quickly, is CEA actually a meaningful solution? Is it something we are going to be able to rely on in the future and that we can actively use? And the answer to that at this minute in time is potentially. It's a little vague, unfortunately. This is still very much a fledgling technology, and if we're absolutely honest at this minute in time, of all the businesses that start up, we see a massive graveyard of them. Many of them go out of business very quickly because by virtue of you needing energy to run this farm, you're going to have quite a delicate balance between the amount of money it costs you to produce produce and the amount that you can derive from the sale of those goods. So there are challenges here. However, there are some massive opportunities as well. We know, for instance, from just consumer choices, that consumers are favouring products which are perceived to be clean, which don't have pesticides or otherwise, and you're not going to need those in a controlled environment. If you've got control over your system, and if you're managing to maintain biosecurity, then you're not going to be needing to spray, to use chemicals or otherwise. It's just not necessary. You can integrate things like big tech. We can start applying the principles of big data, and automation, monitoring software and equipment and everything else to get real fine detail control over everything that's going on. So if a plant requires X amount of nutrients, then we can deliver exactly those nutrients and not one bit more. So we can be extremely specific in terms of the actual chemical application to the plant from the food that plant needs. That obviously is going to save a lot of business resources, but it also saves an awful lot of general resources, because we output a lot of carbon in the production of nitrogen currently for crops. So if we can manage that a bit more effectively, then it's going to be to the good. There is a massively reduced requirement for water in a system like this because we don't waste water. You can set up systems where you recycle it effectively, and the factors, it's about 80% less water than you have in traditional agriculture. This is not something we worry about too much here in Wales. We've got obviously quite abundant water, but in the future, water resources are going to become increasingly precious. So the more that we can spare those, the more control we have over those, then the better that production system is going to be. One of the things I think is most interesting, though, as a possibility for this technology, is the potential for control. If you've got control over the system, there are several things that you can do, but one of those things is to have absolute management over your waste outputs. So if you know exactly what's in the plant waste that's going out to recycling, instead of losing that to the environment, you can employ recycling technologies, anaerobic digestion for instance, and get the energy and the nutrients back out of that material and circulate it back through the farm. So you can set up closed loop, really efficient strategies for how you're actually managing the resources within this environment. And that, I think, is the biggest thing, because that's such a massive issue for us generally in the UK at a production stage. If we can guarantee that the plant comes out looking the same way each time, because why wouldn't it? Every day is a perfect summer's day in a controlled environment agriculture farm, then you can ensure that the waste is minimal to begin with, but the bits that you can't avoid losing, such as the roots and material that's not unedible, stalks, stems, etc., substrate, if you can recycle that, then you're going to be streets ahead of where we are with general agriculture at this minute in time. Okay, so that's the context for why we would do these things, why CEA is potentially worthwhile and why it's attracting such massive interest and investment at this minute in time, and arguably why all the smart money will tell you that this is the future of horticultural production in so many ways. What technology is available at this minute in time though? And I accept there's a bit of a leap of faith here. There's a future you can perceive where you've got hyper-controlled factories with massive automation and all these things, but where are we at this minute in time? Can you effectively set up a CEA system and start producing food? The simple answer to that is obviously yes. There are numerous production systems which are doing so around the globe at this minute in time. USA and Japan are early leaders in this, but the rest of the world is catching up very quickly. You basically need a ponics option, so a hydroponics and aeroponics, etc., but a nutrient delivery and fertigation system for your plant. You need to control your environment. That can be done in numerous ways, but HVAC, heating, ventilation, air conditioning is a typical sort of singular solution, although you will need to consider other factors like humidification control, both dehumidification and rehumidification, because plants can get quite sensitive to either too dry or too moist environments. And if your environment's too moist, you're going to have pest and disease outbreaks too. So those factors need to be considered. You need air handling, so as you avoid sort of hot pockets or arguably dead pockets, i.e. pockets of air without CO2 rich, or that aren't CO2 rich rather. That's obviously no good for your plants. You need a steady flow of fresh air, so you need quite industrial air handling sides, and you obviously need factors like lighting and system control, which is going to be the brains, the electronics behind all of these things. So there are quite a few components, even for a basic system, that are going to need to be considered. But these days they are relatively available. Most of these technologies are off the shelf, unless you are trying to create a major factory system. And we'll have a look at a couple of these very quickly now. Plants are grown in trays and they are stacked under LED lighting systems, so it's all held in there and very much in a factory style setting. So that is perhaps I'm speculating, but perhaps a retrofitted factory, a brownfield site whereby it could have been a warehouse for anything previously. Now it's a food production system. Same principle in this, a little slightly different. They've obviously gone, those look like nutrient film gutters, but they're growing lettuces by the look of it out of those gutters directly. But the same principle here, under LED lights, stacked systems, get as much produce as you can in. And if you consider how much produce is in per stack, whilst it doesn't look like it takes up that much floor space, you've got a lot more than if you just had the surface of the floor covered. This one is growing underground in London, which is a rather bright image in this regard. This has become one of the poster boys for the industry, simply because they've built this growing system into I think it's an old subway station, perhaps a disused air raid shelter or something, but it's underground in London, hence the name Growing Underground. It's tens of metres down from what I understand, so they are producing food in the heart of the city, utilising space which would otherwise be dormant and certainly unsuitable for the production of crops. But with this technology, with the use of LED lighting and with the other environmental control factors, then you can grow plants literally anywhere. In actual fact, as a topical aside, this is the origin of where this technology came from. It was developed originally, or at least brought along on the journey of things a lot by NASA, as a program for working out how you were going to grow plants in space. Obviously, if you need to have protracted space missions, things like that, then you're going to need to producing some fresh vegetables, food, etc. for your astronauts, for health, for psychological reasons as much as anything. So they developed systems where you could grow without soil, utilising water and nutrients and artificial light in order to do so. That technology can still be applied here on Earth. We don't have to go to space to do so, but there's plenty of environments which we could populate with food production, which otherwise, really wouldn't be suitable for crops. So again, thing to take in from this particular production system is the biosecurity involved. The workers there, as you can see, they're in full hazmat gear pretty much, just their eyes showing. That is kind of essential. If you've got a really, really high secure system, you need to keep the bugs out. The minute you get pests and diseases in there, microbial diseases really is what I'm talking about, microbial pests and pathogens, you're going to struggle to get them out of your system. So you do need to factor that in. This is one of, I think this is still Europe's largest. This is the biggest one in Britain anyway, which is the Jones Food Company. They make a range of, or they grow rather, a range of salad products. Basil would be one of their leafy green outputs. But as you can see here, they are a massive system. Their stacks go right to the roof. And they're obviously very closely, densely packed together, and they produce an awful lot of crop. And this is perhaps the most famous in the world, AeroFarms in America, which is obviously a massive factory-style production system based on aeroponics, which I'll come back to what that is in a second. But they have become, again, a really big sort of demonstrator of how this technology can work if you get it right. And that's just them from a different angle. There are issues with this though, and you might be able to see those for yourself immediately. With a stacked system like this, you've got a person there on a cherry picker essentially, which is, I mean, arguably that is a crazy way of doing things. The labour, the time, the energy, the danger, the health and safety elements involved don't really make a fat lot of sense. You kind of need to start thinking about this in terms of automation, in ways in which your human element is reduced slightly. You don't want to take labour out completely. This is, I'm a sort of firm believer that growing systems should have people at the heart of them. But equally, if you're running a stacked system like that, you don't need to be taking chances with your workforce, and you obviously don't need to be slowing production down because you've got to wait for a cherry picker to extend and contract and then move along a little bit and extend and contract. It doesn't really make a lot of sense in those terms. It's an evolving system. Perhaps one of you guys watching this will come up with a solution which will make you a millionaire. You never know. Right, so let's get into the actual sort of nuts and bolts of the technology that's available currently. If we start with the Ponix systems themselves, There are a few options for how you can introduce water and nutrients to your crops. Perhaps the most common at least in greenhouse scenarios currently in horticultural production systems, is ebb and flood. This is where you have a bench style system with your either your crops sown directly into it or standing in flower pots, and these become inundated because you fill a tray that everything is standing in with water and nutrients, inundate the soil so the water rises, it sits there until saturation, and then you let it drain away. Then the water holds and retains a little bit of that moisture, and you redo that with whatever frequency is required subject to your climate. In a hot climate, it's going to be more frequent than a cold one, but essentially you maintain moisture in the pot by constantly inundating and then allowing it to drain away afterwards. It can be quite a wasteful system. Many of the really high quality production systems will recycle the water. So the drain to waste will then be recycled back round to a reservoir and then incorporated back in the fresh water and nutrients that are added in the next round of irrigation. But often, in many of these systems, it is literally drained to waste, as in it is then lost and gone. That's not brilliant control. There's obviously a detriment there in respect of if you're losing nutrients to the environment, you're losing business efficiency. And it's as simple as that. One of the really good things about ebb and flood is it aerates the roots really effectively. By virtue of inundation and then the water draining away, as the water drains away, it pulls air down actually into the substrate after it. So it brings fresh air actually into the root zone, which is a really beneficial effect. Obviously, plant roots need fresh air just as much as plant parts on the surface. Nutrient film technique is another one that's quite similar. This one works on the principle of recirculating water, but it works on a shallow culture. There is also deep water culture, which we'll come to in a second, which is the deep water principle of this. But basically, in this, you've got like a constant flow, a stream of water and nutrients passing by and through the roots that are growing down into them. It has to be passing at a relatively slow speed, otherwise plant is not going to get a chance to actually absorb nutrients. There is a critical speed beyond which this becomes really quite damaging, about 1 litre per minute or so. But the beauty of this is, by virtue of constantly having a moving water and nutrient system, you're aerating that water. It's always fresh water running past. You can integrate factors such as constant monitoring of EC, electrical conductivity, pH, etc., to make sure that your water and nutrients are being delivered right at the optimum conditions for that plant, and you have control over the system. But that constant wetting means that they are not sat in stagnant water, they're not sat in pooled water, they're sat in freshly aerated water, or rather they've got the ends of their roots into that, and it's very beneficial from a growing point of view. Yes, so deep water culture, as I say, is the echo of that from the nutrient film technique. It works in much the same way. You have a recirculating system, but the plant actually grows into a deeper water scenario. So instead of like a constant stream passing, you will have water movement, but because it's deep water, you will need to aerate that water. You'll need to increase the amount of dissolved oxygen content within the water to ensure that the plant has access, or the plant roots that is, has access to sufficient air and oxygen in order to not be detrimental to that plant. One of the other factors you often need with deep water culture as well is to chill the water. After a while, you can find the temperature can increase. That will have an effect from the point of view of pest and disease outbreak. You've obviously got a really fertile mix. If you've got water and nutrients together, bacteria and other bugs will enjoy that just as much as your plants will. And chilling that will help to offset some of those effects. Drip irrigation is it remains, I think, the most common approach to horticultural water and nutrient management. This can be done in controlled scenarios. You can circulate these systems around. Many of the quite advanced growing production systems will have gutters underneath the plants which capture the lost water and nutrients and return them back to the nutrient tank for recycling. So there are systems like that, but this does remain very much a pipe to plant irrigation system where you are piping water and nutrients to that plant and then allowing them to pick up that water as it irrigates the soil and the substrate around them. Okay, aeroponics. This is probably the future of everything, I think, for this industry. That is a bit of a grandiose statement, perhaps, but nevertheless, I think this is really where we're aiming towards. There are issues with aeroponics currently from a production point of view, mainly because it can be extremely costly. It takes a lot of energy because what you're trying to create is a really fine water droplet, almost a mist solution, which gets squirted directly onto the plant roots themselves. So the plants grow in thin air, the root expands out into air, and water and nutrients are fired up onto them, essentially. This can do wonderful things from the point of view of plant production. You get massive amounts of fine root growth, which is obviously very beneficial. That means the plant is much healthier, doing much better, and taking on board more nutrients than otherwise. Growth tends to be bigger as well, but energy usage also tends to be higher. This was the area, I think, for the NASA development that I was talking about before, where they've really got right down to the fine detail of how best to produce plants. But they've got a much bigger budget than the average horticultural production system. The image in the top right from Let Us Grow, which is a young startup in Bristol, is particularly interesting. You can see their system there works on something, I guess we could probably more accurately call it fog or mistoponics rather than aeroponics, because they use sonification, sound waves, to agitate the water and nutrients and create a mist which rises up around the plant roots themselves, coating them in water and nutrients. It's a really interesting company. They're good young guys that are trying to innovate in this industry, and I think they do appear to be onto something, in the sense that it's an excellent way to grow plants. We just need to work out a way from a production point of view of making it slightly more affordable and easy to deploy. So last of the systems that I'll touch on very quickly is aquaponics. It's often something people really, really like the sounds of, because it's a beautiful little closed circular economy where you can grow fish and plants together and kind of use the benefits of one system to derive some benefit in another. So the fish produce waste, for instance, and that waste will fertilize your plants. In reality, the guys that I know that have tried to do this in a commercial sense have struggled. It's really, really hard to have control over two systems simultaneously, and to give the fish exactly what they need and to give the plants exactly what they need is, to say the very least, a challenge. But by the same token, it is something which can be established if you have the right desires to do so. Okay, so we'll move away now a little bit from the actual technology, from the hydroponic side of things and from the fertigation side of things, and talk about the other elements. You have to have light in these systems. We, I suppose, have advanced exceptionally or extraordinarily in the last few years in terms of what lighting can do. Up to now, we used something called HPS, or high pressure sodium bulbs, for just some supplemental top lighting in greenhouse environments. These days, we can do extraordinary things with LEDs. You can tune the spectrum, you can get exactly what you want, you can work out exactly what a plant needs, and you can do things to a plant using light stress to make it produce favourable compounds, or to grow in certain ways, to even change its colour perhaps, which offers the producer a certain an entirely new playbook of things that you might want to do if you were trying to offer novel crops or something along those lines to the major retailers. Sticking with the basics here for this particular video, rather than diving off into my favourite topics of stress, really here we need to talk about just what you want the plant to get. It's red and blue light, which is what we typically need to deliver. Red is the primary actor, but blue is really what's going to give you all of the leaves, the biomass, and the body. So I think the red light, I think if you were to categorize them, red light is the most important, shortly followed by blue, but you need both of those. The reason why you need both of those is plants, as you may recognize yourself, don't reflect red and blue light. They absorb it, which means they're using it, which is why plants appear green to you. If you're absorbing it, you're obviously doing something with it. In this instance, the relative amounts of red and blue light are going to mean you're going to get healthy plants. And tweaking the relative amounts means that you can change how that plant grows, how it flowers, how the size of its leaves, that sort of thing. Those two are the big ones that you need to consider, but there are other factors in there. Increasingly, we recognise portions of UV light, portions of far red light, and absolutely green light are all essential in the mix as well. Most of the new LEDs are trying to recreate sunlight for all intents and purposes, mainly because that probably offers the best overall opportunity for the plants as we have them, given that we're still working with plants which are optimized for natural light environments rather than modified genetically for non-natural light environments. Green light does certain things, like for instance is really good at penetrating the canopy, so it adds to photosynthesis in the lower layers, and we are beginning to understand the importance green light has as well. So you do need to cover the full spectrum, but for many of our production systems they are still predicated on red and blue light only, and you can very much raise crops with just those two elements of the spectrum. Environmental control, I mentioned before, is factors like HVAC. Bottom line is your controlled environment is going to be subject to everything inside that you would expect outside, but you can control it. So temperature, heat, constituents of the air, humidity, etc., etc. And all these things are going to affect the plant. So you're going to need to have control over everything. But also control means that you can change certain things. You can make the temperature warmer, cooler, you can grow crops which obviously would perish outside, but you can also stress crops using these factors to make them produce favourable compounds, things like that. So there are benefits to putting the energy into doing that. But also once you've got a system running, once you've got it, equilibrium's a bit of a strong word, but once you've got it running stably, you can optimize in certain ways for that crop, and hopefully the amount of extra produce you can benefit should balance out the amount of extra energy that is required to run it. So I mentioned the crops there. Let's take a quick look, and this is really a hypothetical, I suppose, more than anything, about what crops really work in CEA systems. That is a difficult one, because the simple answer is you can grow anything at all. You could grow corn if you wanted to. It wouldn't make sense to do so currently, simply because the amount of time it would take to mature corn in that environment and the amount of benefit you would get from the value of that produce at the end would be simply unjustifiable. Products such as lettuce, for instance, there is a reasonable value to that produce on a market shelf. It's going to become increasingly difficult to source, which means demand is likely to go up, and you can harvest things much more frequently. So the crops such as that can be matured in a matter of weeks rather than months. I would suggest that is as things stand. And what I mean by that is we haven't started to selectively breed organisms for controlled environments yet. That is perhaps the next frontier, and I'll talk about that in a second. But once we get to the point where we're selecting crops for certain characteristics, i.e. corn, we've been gradually reducing the height of stalks for the last few hundred years to avoid them lodging in high wind. In principle, we could take that concept further in a controlled environment and start breeding organisms which have no stalk at all. We don't need it. In actual fact, stalk is not an advantageous characteristic. It's just biomass that we're probably not going to use, and it means that we can't stack our layers as closely together as possible. As I say, that is an entirely hypothetical. I'm not suggesting people will want to grow corn in this environment. I'm just pointing out, I suppose, that anything is possible if you want, if you have sufficient desire and demand to grow it. Arguably, at this minute in time, if we're talking about crops, we're talking about pharmaceuticals. The most common is going to be cannabis. Naturally, the conversation always goes back to cannabis, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. You could be talking about daffodils for galanthamine production or something along those lines, which produce higher levels of galanthamine when they're stressed by, well, characteristics which are found in the Black Mountain. We loosely call it the Black Mountain effect. If you could work out what those characteristics are, then you could recreate them in a controlled environment and you could produce daffodil bulbs which have particularly high galanthamine content. That is valuable. Pharmaceuticals are valuable. So if we're producing organisms or plants and flowers which have chemical characteristics from which we can derive value, then you can imagine a production system which is going to make money, essentially. And that's really what it comes down to. You have to justify the energy that you're implementing for the growth of something in the value that comes out the other end. And if you can find a balance for that, then you can set up a production system to do exactly what you want to do. And there are lots of costs within this. I kind of summarised them a little bit in the last slide, but it isn't just the cost of growing the plants. There are consumables that you're going to need. The cost of seed, the cost of nutrients, the cost of packaging, the cost of labour. All of these things need to be incorporated too. Arguably, a lot of the costs which are associated with traditional agriculture are perhaps reduced in controlled environment agriculture, simply because you're going to need less of them. In terms of the nutrients, we can be a bit more prescriptive and a bit more specific. So you can use nutrients perhaps a tiny bit more efficiently. In terms of labour, once we start getting to the point where automation can take charge of some of the less involved tasks, the less technical tasks, then perhaps you can reduce the demand for labour, which in this modern age, again, once more post-Brexit, when labour shortages are going to become ever more apparent in the short term, then factors like this may present a solution to certain problems. But overall, what you need to do is to make sure that you've covered all of the environmental factors required for plant growth, and all of those factors are going to cost you. That is the reality. You're going to need to pay for lights, that's energy. You're going to need to control your air temperature and humidity, that's energy. You're going to need to arguably manage your substrate environment, whether that be the amount of or the temperature at the root zone, but also the amount of nutrients, the constituents of your nutrient solution as well, how much air and oxygen is in that solution. All of that's going to probably cost you money. You're going to need to regulate your airflow, your CO2 level, and your other factors such as the nutrients that are added in. This is a lot of fine details that you need to control, but by the same token, there are all of these things can be controlled, and that is, I suppose, really what we must take away from this. Whilst there are costs and energy burdens to all of these factors, there are opportunities within all of these factors to do things to the plant which may mean that we can create entirely new products for sale. And for me, that's why CEA is going to take off in a big way in the coming years and decades. People are working on the recipes as we speak. There's lots and lots of R&D companies that are desperately invested in the recipes to try and work out how to make these plants, do things that are favourable from a commercial point of view. If you want a lettuce that's really high in vitamin C, if I just pick a random example, then in principle you can ask it to produce that secondary metabolite, or you can ask it to produce that compound if you know the stress or the stressors which can make that plant do so. So light recipes, for instance, changing the amount of UV radiation or the amount of far red spectrum light, or just the variable constituents of light, or nutrient stress, temperature stress, all different climate stress, etc., water stress or otherwise. All of these things will do something to the plant. They will introduce stress to the plant, and as a consequence, that plant will produce compounds to manage that stress. Secondary metabolites are things that we can make use of. They tend to have good chemical purpose. I mentioned galanthamine before within daffodils. we use that as an Alzheimer's drug, that secondary metabolite. So working out what we can produce, working out how to produce them, means that there's an entire playbook of recipes that people can come up with. So there's endless R&D opportunity, and that can only be achieved. We can only do that if we have control over the actual growing system itself. There's a lot of development in the technology. People are particularly keen on the technology. I'll show you a slide in a minute which talks about the future of this sector. People are talking about it being a £100 billion sector inside of a decade. Hard to say how accurate estimation such as that is. It feels like hyperbole, given that it's worth about 3 to 4 billion at the moment. But equally, I see much investment across the board happening constantly in this space. So to think that it's potential or possible, it's not outside of the realms of possibility. Lastly, the other new frontier, I think, the other thing that needs to happen really to make the technology work is we need to start talking about the organism. We are still working with organisms which are optimized for a field environment, and that's not really going to be useful in a controlled environment, or at least it's not optimal for a controlled environment. What we really want to do is to see plants occur or to be developed which are purpose-bred for the characteristics of an environment where you've got entire control over the system. And what I mean by that is, if you imagine a lettuce grows naturally in a rosette formation, the reason for that will be environmental characteristics. Perhaps that's a better structure for defense against pests and pathogens, defense against the cold, rain, that sort of thing. But arguably in a production system like this, what you actually want to do is to grow lettuces that are a single bladed leaf that fit together in nice compact situations, so you can grow lots of them, you can maximize biomass, minimize space between them, not lose any space, and arguably with as little rooting structure as is physically possible to get as much nutrient into the plant, but without wasting energy on producing biomass that doesn't contribute to above ground biomass production, if you will allow me to use ground still, given that there is no ground in this system. That's the concept. You need to be modifying these organisms. And that does offer, again, a wealth of research and development opportunities. It's an entire industry which needs to be developed. And we compare it still to agriculture in a traditional sense, which has been being developed for a millennia. There's a lot that can be stolen from existing knowledge, but there's an awful lot of entirely virgin ground which needs to be broken to understand exactly what the potential capacity is for controlled environment agriculture systems. I'm going to finish this lecture just by touching on a concept which I think in the short term is something is very readily achievable and is the big reason why we want to be doing this. I mentioned before, control means that we can manage our food waste and our systems much more efficiently. We can set up circular economies within controlled environment agriculture scenarios, production systems, which we simply couldn't hope to do in traditional agriculture. And we have to have circular economy solutions. I'm not going to labour this point. You all know that we're trying to transition towards a circular economy because we need to be making maximum use of our resources. We can't simply be making, using, disposing any longer. It doesn't make good economic sense, but we have a single finite planet. And every single year we use up an entire planet's resources about halfway through the year. So we're using, nearer 2 Earths a year in terms of resources, which it doesn't take a mathematician to work out how unsustainable that is. The key word for CEA is control. If you have control over all elements in the system, all inputs and all outputs, then you can work out how to marry some of those inputs with some of those outputs with adequate recycling or intermediary technology. You have a good circular economy just in general. So unlike traditional agriculture, whereby we use lots of water and it gets lost, wasted, arguably it goes into the environment, so it's not necessarily wasted, it's water, it's not harmful, but nevertheless, we don't have maximum water and nutrient use efficiencies. With a system like this, you can recycle materials like that back just inside the farm without actually having to add a different circular economy on. So it has a natural kind of circular focus to it in general, but you can add in other technologies to really maximize your system. And I kind of mentioned this before, so I won't labor the point, but essentially, if you know that you've got plant roots going out, if you've got wasted plant materials, if you're adding them into an anaerobic digester that's part of your plant, or if your plant is co-located with it, you could be recycling the energy, the nutrients, etc. background, and you could be producing other products. So if your intermediary is something like anaerobic digestion, you could be producing solid fraction fertilizer, because obviously at the end of anaerobic digestion we tend to separate the digestate into liquid and solid fractions, and you could be creating alternative products, composts, etc., which could be sold on, and then incorporating some of the nutrients back into your farm. The other factor is, if you are co-locating, anaerobic digesters produce CO2, they produce heat, and you can utilize those things in a growing environment. So again, I use that keyword, it's control. If you have control over the anaerobic digestion system, if you have control over the farm system, if you know how to link the characteristics of these two different systems together to manage your waste, to benefit from the outputs from AD, so it's not being wasted, because CO2, whilst harmful to the atmosphere, is actually quite a useful product in terms of photosynthesis and plant production. We don't want to be wasting it. If we can utilize it, we can benefit from it. And that will push us towards a zero waste future, which is obviously the goal as we move forwards. We have to be maximising all of our recycling and all resource use efficiencies to ensure that we have stable production systems for the future. Okay, we are coming to the end, so I'm literally just going to close by, as I promised, just showing you a little bit about the ag tech scene as it is. There is investment flying around everywhere for a range of companies. Interestingly, the one there on the top right, which was Plenty, which to the best of my knowledge has still attracted the largest investment so far, around about 200 million of startup sort of round 2 funding injection. I haven't heard from them since. I'm not entirely sure what they're doing or where they're going. I assume they're working on their technology before deployment. But they were supposed to be setting up farms right across the US to be producing and delivering right into store. The big ones are still going to be attracting money, AeroFarms, etc. But increasingly, there is a lot of people out there, investors, which are really, really keen on this space and to put money in. So the guys that can come up with technology, that can come up with scenarios where you can increase production potential, then you're going to find some funding. You really are. But there are perils too. There are plenty of businesses in this space which start up and which perish very, very quickly, because it isn't as simple as buying some racking and growing some plants. You have to manage your environment with real precision and delicate care, but it's possible. And that, I think, is the thing to really take away. If you're interested in learning how possible it is, then there is a course for you. Obviously, I lecture on this course for Bioinnovation Wales. I teach controlled environment agriculture alongside my colleague Peter Wooson-Beard. We have put together a module which goes into detail about the state of play at this minute in time, and we'll look at some of the biological elements, how you can stress plants, what you can do, etc., and how it relates to the technology. But it obviously is going to go into far more detail than I can cover in a short lecture here. But if you are interested, perhaps that is a good way to get in, and it's subsidised if you're in Wales still at the moment, so it won't cost you too much. I think that's enough for today. That's enough to get your teeth into. If anyone wants to discuss this further, if you'd like to know more about specifics, or if you want to pick brains about the different elements of technology and whatnot, then contacting me is really easy. You can either Google Dr. Will Stiles at Aberystwyth University and you'll find my contact page, or you can obviously find me through the Knowledge Exchange Hub with Farming Connect, which is a very easy thing to do. I will say thank you ever so much for listening. I don't really have a final thought as such. I think I've made my position clear. I do believe this is going to be how we progress in the future. This is how horticultural production will eventually transition to. Eventually could be 10 or 100 years. I mean, who's to say in that regard? But I think this is going to become a more meaningful part of horticultural production in the near term. So we are going to see the rise of big controlled production systems very, very shortly. Thanks for listening, everyone.